this. Uh, this is really meant for like the 30,000 foot level view of a transaction as you go through it. So, you know, the next class next Thursday will be really down to dirty details. This is sort of, let's take a quick walk through a transaction and how you need to think about this a little bit. This is a class that usually takes me 3 hours. Actually, there's the whole session is actually 4 3-hour classes. We're going to squeeze part of that into 1 hour and then another part into next Thursday, 1 hour. So I'm going to sort of rock and roll a little quickly, but feel free to ask any questions or whatever. That's probably the most important part, is that we sort of, it stimulates you into a question or two. If you have it, you can certainly feel free to ask while I'm going through the presentation, or an alternative, you certainly can send me an email or call me afterwards and we can talk about anything going forward. Let's see. And you should be seeing a screen that says 1, 2, 3 across the top. I'm assuming that's the case. If it's not, let me know. I see nobody going crazy or anything, so I'm assuming you're seeing what I'm seeing. I just wanted to go over this, at all of your onboardings, I've gone through this, but I just wanted to, again, just remind you of where and how you can get help. Certainly, we have a broker on call system that's 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 at night, and they certainly can answer most of your questions. Are handpicked people with experience, each one with their own strengths and weaknesses. So they may, in fact, refer you to me if they feel it's out of their expertise. But they're all, the great thing about them is they're all volunteers. Each of the day you have one agent on board, and they have pretty well trained and understand that if it's not something in their wheelhouse, they'll go ahead and refer it over to me, and feel free to do that if you're not comfortable with an answer or whatever. Number 3 is our off-site reviewing broker, Chantel. She can answer many of your questions on contract compliance review, clearing commissions, getting you paid, which is why we're all here, and certainly the CE course delivery and risk management she handles. It all sits under me, so I'm your main contact. You're more than welcome to give me a call at any time. If you're in serious trouble, or you really don't know what to do or where, or you get an email from an attorney or the state, give me a call immediately and we can chat through it and get you taken care of. Let's see, where are we going? We just talked about that, but here's the broker on call number, the 503. Whoops, that's my number. God, I should know that one. Is area code 503-880-4905 is my direct cell phone. You feel free to use that. Broker on call, which is the 503-924-3540. So that's how you get help. Now let's talk a moment about where you can get information. Yeah, somebody says, gee, I want to put my house on the market, and you're trying to figure out, do you want the listing? Number 2, how do you educate yourself real quick? The first way is you can order a trio from the title company. The title company will actually send you one if you call them or email them. I just have automatically, the first time somebody calls me and says they're thinking about listing their house, I just go and type off an email. In fact, it's a predisposed or preset email, and I just put the address in. It said, send me a trio. That puts some to work while you're finding out additional information. You can look it up in RMLS and see if it's ever been on the market and what that information is at that time. You could, in fact, if it's been on the market, even if it hasn't, you can use RPR, which is an RMLS product. that gives you a good overview of taxes, RMLS information, just an assortment of places. None of these are gospels, but they're places to look to trigger what and give you a quick perspective. Obviously, as you get closer, you can certainly ask the listing agent for the property disclosure even before you make an offer if you want to see it, depending on the type of client you have. Some want, you got an engineer, for example, they're going to want to see everything they can. This is one of the things you can show them. And then ultimately, you can also order what they call a prelim report, which is usually done after you have a sale, but you could also order it before, talk to your title officer, they'll prepare one for you. For example, you might want to see that if in fact you think the house may be in foreclosure. You're looking at RPR, it shows that a notice of default has gone out to them and everything. You want to see maybe a little bit more detail because you want to know if they have enough equity to sell, what their position is. And you certainly can order a preliminary title report and ask your escrow person about it. But it essentially gives it's a deep dive into what the title looks like. So I would urge you if you think that's necessary, and that as we're starting to get into a little more difficult market, you always want to know, do they have enough money to in fact sell the property and pay off the debts on it. If they can't pay off the debts but they still need to sell, that puts it into the opportunity of being a short sale, which essentially is a sale with the seller, but essentially asks the seller or asks the bank or whoever the lien holder is to forgive part of that debt so they can clear title and sell the property. And if you start getting into those situations, please feel free to sit down with me. If you want a little length of time, just call me. I just set an appointment of time. We could do a Zoom call. We could do a phone call. We could do email information, or I certainly can meet you at the office at any time. We can just sort of sit down and chat and walk you through the process. Okay. Let's start talking about a little bit about the process of putting a sale together. The first and most important thing you need to do is give them your potential, if you're with a potential buyer or a potential seller, you first have to disclose agency. And that's the OREF 40 or 41, depending if it's a buyer or a seller. And it's they typically just call it the agency pamphlet that essentially discloses what agency is, the representation of them. It talks about a little bit about if in fact you're representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. It tells you what your limitations are with that. It also just talks about what my role is. Essentially, the reason you need to give them that here, and you also have a disclosed limited agency, is because even though you may only represent one side, if the other side is also represented by our brokerage, not any KW, but specifically our brokerage, then we're in a dual. I represent both sides because I supervise both agents. And if you want to sit down and talk about that, that's probably one of the more confusing points in the sales contract, and we'll continually hit that subject as we go through today and also next Thursday. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about residential sales contract and the other property type. There are some specific, there's the standard residential sales contract, which we'll go through on next Thursday, but it also there are a number of property types. There's a specific one for condos, there's a specific one for commercial. So those types of things you can take a look at. We'll talk about the others other than residential, but we'll go through a residential next week. We talked a moment about Oregon property disclosure. and we'll continue to talk about that more both today and Thursday. Uh, the inspection and special conditions, we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's go here. And also we'll talk a little bit about the release of the inspection loan contingency. Okay, we talked about, I just mentioned that there were several different kinds of sales agreements that are geared to that particular type of business. There's a general residential sales agreement. There's a condo sales agreement, which addresses those special issues that are involved with a condo. For example, you have an HOA, and a true condo really owns from the paint in. So you have to talk about what does the HOA do, how much is owed. There's a whole process, and we'll talk about that a little bit. In fact, while we're here, we'll just talk about it now. That particular sales agreement is geared for condos, because with a condo, different than residential, there's a heavy HOA. They have a lot of responsibility, and they also have a responsibility to make sure there's enough reserves. So you need to be asking, one, is there a reserve study on it? And the reserve study talks about how much they hold in abeyance or for future problems. Are they scheduling a certain amount being assigned to replacing the roof? Because we know one way or another way you're going to be replacing the roof at some time. So are they putting the money aside? Are they expecting some sort of an assessment? Right. Every once in a while, you'll find that condos will all of a sudden say, "Well, gee, we have to do this, that, and the other. We don't have enough money, so we're going to assess everybody." I have one that's I just talked to the seller, and he's going to get a $35,000 assessment to him. You want to make sure those are all resolved prior to closing the transaction, and that's what that specific sales agreement does, because it talks about what are each of the things you should be asking the seller to get from the HOA. That also, by the way, is meeting notes. That's also the phone number of who the HOA president is, and I would urge your people to, give them a call, talk to them. Presidents of HOAs usually are pretty open with having that type of discussion with you. So I would urge you to do so. And with all disclosures, you do not want to be the source of the information. You want to be the source of the source, right? Directing your buyers that here's where you can find out this or that and wherever else. And then it puts the responsibility on them, because they're spending the money, they need the education. And if you've ever been down to the planning department or whatever, what they tell you and what they tell the next person can be very different. So you want your buyers to hear that information directly and not through you. You certainly, responsible to recognize red flags, but you need to make sure your people understand that they need to research that. You'll be glad to go down with them and look at it, but you just need to go through it and have that information. There's also one that for new construction, and addresses the different contingencies and things that might be in new construction. And depending on where the product is, but you could have everything from somebody building something from scratch and dirt. You don't even have anything to walk through. So you handle home inspections differently. You handle a lot of things differently. And depending on how it's financed, you secure that path to making the sale, and the criteria for the contractor. What's he going to do for you? Okay. There's a farm and country one that addresses acreage. You find that out of Oregon City. You see a lot of it, Newburgh, McMinnville area, and certainly out Hillsborough and out from there. You'll run into that. Lots of land Could be everything from just bare land acreage to a lot in a subdivision. But again, it goes back and addresses the information from there. How's everybody doing? Everybody's, we're still going forward here? Okay, cool. Just want to make sure I hadn't bored you to death yet. Let's see. Okay, that should brighten your day a bit. This is just sort of an overview of the life of a transaction. Understand a transaction, there's lots of things happening at the same time. And each one of these columns is a path. The column on the far left is the basic, process, and then each time you have other things happening. And when you get to the end of the transaction, all of those columns meet, and that will allow you to close. For example, you start off, you do the home search, you write and present an offer, you get an accepted offer. Now the question is, what's in the offer? You'll normally have a home inspection, and there's a path that goes down where you have, and that's usually a contingency. So really, you start with the main tree that talks about writing the offer, what it takes to close the offer, meeting the legal obligations, and then closing. But along the way, you have contingencies. One is that you'll have a home inspection, and that has its own path. So you have to go over, do a home inspection, review the inspection, find out any information you might need as far as, for example, I just had one where we had to go out and bid a sewer. So that took a little bit longer, and we extended some things. Remember, the sales agreement is a living document. So one, you want to put the protections in there to protect your buyer or seller, the sort of what if happens. And then you want to then go to and have each one of those contingency has its own path off the main tree, which is your far left column. As we talked, we had the home inspection. There's a contingency. We just went through that. The loan, while you're doing the home inspection, you've applied for the loan, and the loan app starts. And the loan process includes doing all the, gathering all the information from the seller or the buyer, more importantly, the buyer on a loan. And you're asking, you're going to go through the verification of employment, verification of deposits, and just verifying the complete financial health of that individual. They're going to have an appraisal. The appraisal goes out, and they determine, and their main thing is to determine value, right? Is there enough value in this property to sustain a loan, right? Is it, and that's usually sales price, based on a sales price. So the appraisal verifies that. After the lender gets all their information together, then in fact they send it to an underwriter, and that underwriter in today's market can be anything from a live person to an automated process. Many of the lenders now today are doing an automated process, and if they think they need to go further, then they'll go through a more rigorous person who will review, an underwriter reviews. And then once you get that process, then that's all goes to the closing, and they deliver paperwork for the closing, but they also go through the process. And then the final area is that you open escrow. Escrow is the people that look at the title and say, do I have a clear title, or can I provide a clear title? They insure your title to make sure that you have clear title. You don't have some lien that's going to come back to you. And I, be quite frankly, what I would suggest, that I can help you a lot with it, but I would suggest that maybe you spend some time in each one of these categories, with a home inspection, with a lender, with escrow, is spend some time with each one of those people to get their perspective. And all of them will spend some time with you and just say, how does your business work? What are you looking for? And from there. So back to the original conversation of, we open escrow, we do a preliminary title report. Preliminary title report gives an overview of the property's financial condition, what type of loans on it, what type of easements on it, etc. Questions are on it, and the questions should go back to title. They're the ones that answer the questions. You don't want to interpret that. You want the professional in title to do it. You'll find you're responsible for a lot of these things, but you're not the expert in it. So don't be careful not to make yourself the expert, but make yourself the expert in finding an expert for your buyer or seller. You'll also want the HOAs and CC&Rs, the documentation. They're usually all wrapped up in the prelim. The actual financial health of the HOA is a separate contingency, which is why you use the condo agreement for an HOA in most cases. If you have an HOA, but the property's not owned by a condo association, then you need to ask for HOA documents, and there's a form specifically for that, so that you do still get the HOA documentation. And then that, again, once you have clear title company will say, gee, we have clear title and we're going to release it. And they'll usually give you clear title with the exception of easements and just a number of different things on it that can become part of the property. Okay. Inspections. Let's talk about inspections a little more detail. You'll normally have, you may or may, in the sales agreement, there's a home inspection contingency, and usually it's 10 business days, but it can be any number of days that you really want. But 10 is the default. You'll set up an inspection period. In that inspection period, you usually have an inspector come out, and then any other area that the inspector calls out or you have concerns with. And many times you'll find an inspector says, gee, you know, I'm concerned about the roof, or I'm concerned about the HVAC system, which is heating and cooling systems, you know, but they are not experts in those areas, and ask for you to get a separate inspection or recommend that. Or electrical, there's a couple of electrical panels that are really questionable and probably should be replaced in most cases. Federal Pacific is the one you see the most of. And there's some class action suits on those that replaced. The plumbing, you know, you may find the inspector says, gee, you have a 1960s house, which means you probably have galvanized pipes. You know, you should really have a plumber go down and take a look at it. So in this living document, you could have additional inspections added, and then by the inspector requesting it. Your buyer could say, yeah, I want to have it, or no, I don't want to spend the money to have those additional inspections to it. You have other inspections that you'll want to do just automatically, or just have your buyer decide if they want to do. Sewer inspection is real typical in today's market, and you know they're not that expensive, $100 or whatever, and they'll give you a visual to it. And what you think is a good system, and all of a sudden they run a camera down the pipe, you could find out that, you know, you have tree limbs, or not tree limbs, but roots growing through it or whatever. That's why you do a photo tour of a sewer. Nothing like sitting back and watching the 45 minutes of a sewer investigation. Boring TV, but it can be expensive for buyer and seller. Replacing a sewer can be, you know, $10,000 to $15,000. So you want to make sure that it's worth the investment of your buyer to have that. A radon inspection. Uh, the alternative is if radon's high and you don't do the inspection, is that you could very easily get some form of disease if the radon is high and you don't know it and you're living in the house. So that's another place. And I think it's, personally, I think it's more important than a sewer inspection. A sewer, you miss a sewer problem, it's $10,000 or $15,000. A lot of money, but you live. Excess radiation in the house, you may not live. So I always put radon above a sewer issue. It's above a sewer inspection, because it's, even regardless, I've seen radon, be just about anywhere in places that, no, don't worry about it. We don't have any radon. You do one, and then the radon comes back high. It's just not worth the risk. I would surely hate to have one of my buyers get sick or whatever, and we could have prevented it, and we decided to cheap out on a radon inspection. I think it's just important. There are other inspections you may want to consider whether you have or not. Mold inspection, your inspector, overall inspector general, inspector will be able to tell you if there's mold or not, and then whether you need additional investigation. And mold sometimes is a very cheap fix. Sometimes, depending on the extent, it could be a very expensive one, but it's one you need to know about. And then, of course, if you're looking for land or buying land outside of, the city limits, everything, you'll have a septic system and you'll have a well inspection that you'll have to do. Each one has their own special methodology and professionals. I mean, septic, I always laugh a little bit. You get some really wild names from some of the inspection companies or septic people. I mean, I think the one that just sort of reminds me of it, or I think about, is, well, I think one guy is called Little Stinky, and there's a couple of them out there that are good for some cute laughs, but it's an important process. And a well inspection, you need to know, and the only thing the seller's required on a well inspection is to make sure the water is potable, or rather, it doesn't have fungus in it, it doesn't have nitrates in it, and it's just basic. It does not do a full. They're not required to do a full inspection. So just because the seller said, this is where my requirements are, and I've given you the inspection, it doesn't tell all the story, because you also want to know, well, what's the flow? Do I have 15 pounds per minute, or do I have, or 15 gallons per minute, or less? That does not show up on the seller's version or requirement. And if you start getting less than that, all of a sudden you find out you don't have a lot of water pressure in the house. And even more importantly, how long does that water last? Right? You essentially have a deep hole that continues to fill up with water. How quickly does it fill up, so you don't have, 10 minutes of flow, and then all of a sudden you have to wait a half hour for the well to sort of fill up again or drain. So there's a whole list of those types of questions you have, and you're not the expert, so you want to make sure you go to the expert. Certain times you might want to waive a home inspection. I do not recommend it, but it's one way in a multiple offer situation that you could make your offer more attractive. I don't recommend it, and I don't think it, if you got an investor or something, maybe, because they're a little bit more savvy than a normal buyer, but I don't recommend it. But it is one of the things that sometimes people talk about, and they took one offer over another because they didn't have the risk of a home inspection. So anyway, just food for thought. not high on my list. Before you do that, I'd like you to have a conversation with me so we can talk through it and make sure it's the right incentive and the right thing to do to protect your buyer. Okay. The inspection period we talked about, it's 10 business days, but there's a fill as default. You can fill in the blank to any number of days you really want. The buyer usually does a repair addendum, which is OREF 22A. If the seller says no, I don't agree with what the buyer asks. Some buyers feel the need to do a laundry list. I sort of look at it and say, gee, where are you by the offer? But certainly safety issues should be addressed, in my opinion, depending on, what you're dealing with. If they do it, this is dressed a little differently than a normal sales agreement where you have a counter offer. Here, the buyer puts forth an addendum. The seller has a choice of one of two things. They can accept it as is, they can reject it outright, or they could just reject it and write an additional repair addendum from their side. Just remember that while you're doing that, it does not carry, right? If the guy has 20, the buyer comes in with 20 different items on it. The seller says, I'll do 5 of them. You will also, it does not carry those 15 to the next one. Most counteroffers, what they'll do is, the counteroffer says, I accept everything that was done on the counteroffer, but I do not accept, or I want to make the following changes. With this buyer and seller repair, it's all or nothing. You either accept it or reject it, and then you can write a counteroffer if you so desire. I know that probably sounds as clear as mud, but I'll be glad to walk through it a little bit when you got one, and explain it a little further, and we'll talk a little bit more about it next week. The repair addendum, just want to leave in your head, most importantly, is you have a number of days you have to do the home inspection. If you do not change the offer or do some sort of repair addendum and you go past that deadline, you lose the right to argue about it, right? And that includes negotiation, right? All inspections and a final negotiation and acceptance needs to happen by that end of that 10 days, or it automatically accepts the property as is. So you have to make sure you're working within that 10 days at 5 o'clock to be sure. Now you have the other side of the coin is you go in and do a home inspection and you find out, gee, I can't tolerate this house. I want out of here. There's you have to write an addendum that simply says, and it's OREF 64 for whatever that's worth. And by the way, next Thursday, I'll talk about the individual forms and which ones are which, a summary of them, so you know what is available to you, and give you a little more details. I'm just sort of want to go through the process a little bit today. So if it'll all come together, I guess is what I'm saying. And if it doesn't, come on by and we'll chat about it. But if you want out of the transaction, or you want to, no fixing in the world will allow you to go forward, then by that 5 o'clock on that last day, you need to write up a termination notice and an addendum indicating that you unconditionally disapprove of the home inspection and you wish to terminate the transaction. So the other side of the coin is say you get into this, you do the home inspection, you're getting close to that end date, but you still have to do another inspection, or you haven't fully negotiated the repairs yet. Remember, this is a living document, so all you have to do is just make sure that you watch what date it is, and then leave yourself enough time to do an extension if you need it. For example, is that you may, for example, have, do the home inspection, and part of that home inspection is a sewer inspection. Find out that from a sewer scope that the sewer needs to be replaced. At that point in time, the seller is going to want to go out and get some bids. But as with usually happens, is that you find out that the sewer is bad. You got 2 days to negotiate this, and in fact, you give me a second here. So you really don't have enough time to get the bids as the clock ticks. Well, it would be my suggestion is that you, rather than trying to force this down a seller's throat in a short period of time, I would suggest just simply having an extension that extends it an extra 4 days. And if you know up front that you're gonna be highly pressured at the last minute to do negotiations, that in fact you do an extension. Either way, whether you unconditionally disapprove, or you need an extension, or you just need to negotiate, make sure you don't wait till the last minute. I can tell you, I get calls at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Somebody says, "Hey, what do I do? The seller hasn't responded to my request." Well, when did you give the request? Well, I gave it to them at noon today. And realistically, there's not enough time for the seller to take a look at it. And you just don't want to put anybody in that type of position, or yourself, because reality is now at 4 o'clock, I sort of look at it and say, not a lot I can do at 4 o'clock on the day it expires, other than you're just going to have to unconditionally disapprove or accept it as is, and that's not right either. So, always leave yourself enough time. I just had one myself that I had. The issue is we were going to run out of time. So 2 days before the end, I did an extension I did it with a date certain, and 5 days gave the buyer an extra five days, or gave both the buyer and the seller really an extra 5 days to get bids, and then to go ahead and agree to what they are once they know the numbers. You never want to accept a repair addendum unless you have a pretty good idea of prices. But you'll find many buyers just will line list all the items that they want. Yeah, you really, in my opinion, you really need to put some sort of a cap on it. Especially if there's an expensive repair. Somebody says the roof's bad, you replace the roof. Well, a roof can vary. For example, from a basic $7,000 roof to they tear off the roof and find out that they need another 20 sheets of plywood or whatever. So you really want to say, if you're agreeing to 7,000, then you write seller to replace roof and not to exceed $7,000. That caps them at least, and it prevents it from escalating the price until you approve it. And that doesn't mean they come in and all of a sudden say, "Yeah, we told you 7, it's really 10." You still may very well accept it, but at least you want a trigger that says, I can say no if it exceeds what we're talking about here. Hopefully that makes some sense to everybody. Okay. Contingencies. As I said, you know, when I look at this sales agreement, you have the basic sales agreement or tree, and then I just ask, you know, a buyer, well, why wouldn't you? What are your concerns that would prevent you from buying this house? And I just write them on a yellow pen. Those things are what you want to formulate into contingencies. Gee, you know, contingent right to sell. Gee, I can't buy the house unless I sell my house, and it doesn't have a sale on it yet. So that's a contingent right to purchase. You could say, it could be, I have a sale of my house, but it hasn't closed yet, which is the more normal process. So you want to do a contingency, and the contingency is simply, the transaction is subject to closing of my personal residence at 1340 High Street. So, let's see, so, and they're just there's an option to lease document. If you have somebody who wants to do a lease option, where they want to rent the house and then decide in a year if they want to buy it or not, my recommendation is there's other ways to do that. For example, you might do that, for example, if somebody had declared bankruptcy 9 years ago and you need 10 years of clear credit. So they may come in and say, I want a year lease and then I want to buy the property. Instead of doing that and having a lease where the buyer decides they want to buy or not, you do the reverse and say, okay, we have a sale, let's do a sales that'll close 1 year from now, and put you in a better position to make sure that you earn a commission. See, is there anything else? You know, short sales, that they have their own list of contingencies because they're all contingent upon clearing the bank. You have to understand with a short sale, which means the underlying loan is accepting less than what is really owed them. With those, you have to understand it's still owned by the original seller. The bank just needs to give approval. So though you're negotiating with the bank, the reality is it still needs seller approval of the short sale. So, and at some point we'll have a class on that separately. There will be, but there's not a lot of short sales out there right now. So don't really worry about them. But you get into any of these special situations, just give me a call. We'll chat through it and make sure that you're in good shape there. Okay. In our documentations, there are a number of advisories that you can give your buyer and seller, depending on. There's a condominium buyer advisory, a vacant land advisory regarding seller carried transaction, and heaven, if you do anything else, if it's a seller carried, see me immediately. The rules have gotten much tougher and how to handle it. I've done a number of them. They can be fun, but they can also be dangerous. So if you're talking about seller carried, just let me know. We'll chat through that one also. But also there's a specific document or advisory to that. So an advisory for transferring funds, an advisory for purchase of bank loans, and advisory on FIRPTA tax. And each one is an individual situation that OREF, which is OREF is Oregon Real Estate Forms, which is a group. It's a separate group that has put these together based on sitting down with different agents and saying, what types of advisory needs? Where do you get yourself into trouble? These are all areas that just need a little more information. There's also a form which I will go over next week, which we've put together here, multi-informational disclosure form, which just sort of goes through each of the topics that are risk sensitive and just gives a quick overview of them as a summary. And your buyer and seller will sign that when they sign their documentation. Yeah, lots of this mainly you've probably done, you've already done early in before you can make your offer, but the RMLS listing will give you the property detail. You can look at the history before making an offer, so you know if it's been on and off the market 3 or 4 times, or whether it's sale failed 3 or 4 times, or had several price reductions, or it's fresh on the market. They'll just give you some information. The remarks section of the listing information, please read it. It's usually, there's 2 parts of it. One's a private remarks and the other is public remarks. But the private remarks are from the other agent. Many times they have instructions to what's important to the seller. It gives you just some very specific information, and sometimes you can read between the lines and get an advantage or not. And they do some showing instructions in there, but just please read it. It's important. I can't tell you how many times, I've put something in private remarks and an agent comes back in and asks me the same question. I have written contingencies that says seller to do X, and meanwhile, I've talked about X in the private remarks. So you can get data from different sources. We talked about this earlier, Property Trio, and that's essentially a tax overview, property profile, plat map, deed, city tax, and then planning departments. Do not go down to the planning department on your own. Make sure that you're sending your buyers down. You'll tell them you'll be glad to go down with them or anything else. What planning departments say to them, especially if it's important to them, they need to hear it directly from the planning department. Again, don't be the source of the information. Be the source for the source. Hey, if you want to develop this piece of land, go down to the planning department. I'd be glad to go down with you, and we'll just review what you need to do to have that happen, how big of an issue it is. If you in fact touch any of that information, including, by the way, just going down and asking for a packet and hand carrying it to the seller, you now are responsible for that information. We had a claim some years ago, just that. The seller was going out of town. There was a planning meeting. He asked our agent, who was a listing agent, or it was the listing agent, hey, would you go to this meeting, pick up this documentation, and pick it up for me? Well, in it talked about well water and some other issues involved, and he just disclosed a lot of information what was going to happen to the well. So it turned out the buyer came back and said, it's not what you told me it was. And in fact, you knew it and didn't disclose. And said, and by the way, Mr. Listing Agent, it's your fault too, because you had the information in your hand, and and in fact, so that means if you had it in your hand, you knew it. How can you, don't tell me that you didn't, you had a problem and you carried it all the way to the seller and you didn't look through it, and so we ended up having an E&O claim from it to it. So let's see. Uh, let's talk a little bit about, we talked about the initial agency disclosure. And there's several conditions, as I think I talked about. Seller's agent represents only the seller. Buyer's agent represents the buyer only, or disclosed limited agency, which represents both the buyer and the seller or multiple buyers who want to purchase the same property. This can be done only with written permission of both parties. Now, there's two situations. It could be it's your listing and a buyer comes to you and wants you to write an offer on the property. And therefore you may be in a position to write, though you have both sides, you also represent both sides. And which means you have some limited representation to it because you, in fact, know some information and you're required not to tell anybody about that information. I mean, I'm talking about legal information. I'm not talking about hiding stuff. But I mean, for example, you have a listing, your seller says, yeah, you know, I know we have it listed at 439, but if somebody told me they would do 400,000 all cash, I would probably do it. What limits them is you can't tell the buyer coming in that information. The same way as you could, and now that the buyer, you represent the buyer also, you can't tell them that that the buyer said that he would pay 450 for the property, but his offer is only 425 here. So the limitation is you can't share any information that you wouldn't have told another agent to it. There's also besides having a buyer come in on your own listing, it could be, especially in today's market with limited inventory, is it could happen that you have you represent as a buyer's agent two different buyers looking for a house at the same general price range, and both of them decide they want to make a bid on it. So that's limited agency, and you have to disclose that also. That, gee, Mr. Buyer A, I have another buyer who not only has looked at the house and knowing looked at the house, wants to write an offer as you write an offer. I can't share information as I normally might because you just represent both parties now. In either of these cases, an alternative may be your first responsibility is to talk about representation. The second is and personally, I'm not comfortable with limited agency disclosed representing the same buyer and seller. The alternative might be to refer it to another agent. For example, a listing, you get somebody who wants to buy the property, have another agent just handle it, and then pay you a referral fee. You know, a little less money, a lot safer, but that's, you know, either way it can be handled. Now, the other issue is limited agency. If I have two agents, if I have the buyer's agent and the seller's agent, both with Keller Williams Realty Portland Premier, you guys treat those people as independent buyer and seller. Because I supervise both sides, both agents on each side of the transaction, I am at disclosed limited agencies, which is why you have to do the documentation regardless of how you handle it to it. And just as an aside, you have to remember that that includes your dual representation rate. Or let me try it a different way. Keller Williams Realty Portland Premier and each one of the other Keller Williams are different companies, even though they're franchised with the same Keller Williams Realty. You have Portland Premier, You have Keller Williams Elite, Keller Williams Realty Professionals. They're all separate companies. So just an aside while we're here, I wanted to mention that. So you think of them as you sort of would think that it's all the same company. They're not. They're different entities owned by different people. It's like there's different McDonald's owned by different people. Hopefully that makes some sense. Looks like you're still all here. Okay. Let's see. And disclosures. I have two rules where people get themselves in trouble. And I call them the double D's. First is disclose, disclose, disclose. If you ever have a choice of should I disclose, the odds are it's yes. And the other part of the D scenario is document, document, document. If you ever do something in a transaction and somebody's not sure, you never can get yourself hurt by over documenting, because you want to make sure that anything you write, you want to be explicit about the information. Okay. Let's go through. So property disclosures again, this is the same thing that we talked about a little bit before, that you don't want to be the source of the information. The same way as you can't help the seller fill out the property disclosure. I mean, you can't even handwrite in what they tell you to write in. They have to complete it. If you started doing either of that, you now become responsible for it. And that's not a good thing. Let's see, multi-information disclosure. We're just about out of time. These are all just different types of disclosures, and we'll talk a little further next week. Any questions or whatever anybody have?
Mike, I have a question for you. It's my understanding that inspections, in terms of additional inspections beyond just the main home inspection, I understand that you are not to provide the results of any inspection to the seller unless requested by the seller. But is there a method that we use for conveying or justifying any price reduction in the offer during the negotiation period, the reduction in the offer price based on that inspection that holds weight with the seller and their representative, the other agent, without providing that inspection, so that gives them confidence or faith that those numbers are based on something real?
Okay, with an inspection, you're not allowed to deliver a report without authorization. For example, you have a regular home inspection, you want to ask for repairs, you can't send them the copy of the report unless they would like to have it. And you're required to give it to them if they ask for it. My recommendation, we'll go to the rest of your question before I talk about that. What I usually do is just simply do a repair addendum saying these are the things that I would like fixed. I mean, you can still disclose what they are because that's part of the asking. And you ask the other agent, do you need any additional information? You know, but you want to write on the inspection report very specifically what the repair is to be.
Are you recommending then that we request a repair rather than a reduction in price based on that?
No, I don't think it doesn't matter. You can write just simply, you know, seller to reduce price $10,000 or to apply $10,000 to buyer's closing costs.
And is it a fairly standard assumption that dollar figure of reduction requested is based on some sort of estimate you've obtained for that repair?
Yeah, typically.
Documentation of that beyond the negotiation communication
Well, I
between.
mean, if I was asking for 10,000, I might verbally have the conversation that says, look, we found these items sitting here that we're concerned. We're willing to handle them, but would like to have you cover the cost of them. The cost is approximately $10,000, or the cost is 12,000, but I'm only asking you for $10,000 to it. You know, if you'd like, I'd be glad to send a report to you with those items on it.
Okay, great.
But you just can't arbitrarily send it to them. And the other side of it is it's my recommendation as a listing agent, and I usually have this conversation with my seller, is I'm not sure that you can get away with the conversation, I didn't know because I didn't see the report. And you'll find many attorneys take that position, thank heaven. You know, we as a real estate community, you know, there was a split in it. You know, some people were accepting of the report. Some people would send the report if they know there was something bad in the report, just to tick off the other agent, which is not good. So the sales agreement has really shifted to don't give somebody the information, and therefore they're not responsible for it. It's my belief you go to court and you say, well, I didn't see the report. Yeah, but did you know there were repairs? Well, I didn't know which ones, but did you know there were repairs and you haven't done your due diligence to investigate? I don't think putting your hand across your eyes and it really solves the issue. Nor do I think that in a court proceedings, I'm not sure that would hold much water.
Right. I guess thinking about it from both sides, providing, I guess the main question is providing some assurance that the request for repair is based on a legitimate inspection report without showing that report. Is that just part of the good faith? We assume that everyone's working on good faith.
Well, I mean, you have an alternative. It's just not an automatic. I mean, automatically as a listing agent, I really want to see what the report said. You know, the problem is once you see the report, then you're required to disclose it.
Right.
I don't think, you know, putting your hand in saying, gee, I don't see it. You know, the old kid story, nah, 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 I didn't hear it. I don't think that really makes it in the legal world. Nor because my conversation is really, did you know there was a repair that was needed? Yeah, but I don't have to disclose it because I didn't see the report. But did you know? You do. And so I always encourage on the disclosure side. I just think you're better off. From a legal point of view or a methodology point of view in our documentation, the sales agreement says we don't have to give them a report or shouldn't give them a report unless they ask for it. But once they know, my opinion is I think they're obligated to ask for it. And you know, I have no problem with that. It is what it is. If it has a bad sewer, it has a bad sewer. You know, do you pay the 10,000 to get it fixed? Do you put it back on the market, pay the 10,000 to raise your price 10,000 if the market will tolerate it? I mean, there are other options, but in my opinion, as a buyer and the seller had gone through a sale fell and he knew there was repairs and didn't do them and didn't disclose them, I'd be pretty ticked off. Ticked off enough that I would probably go to an attorney who I think would have a field day with it. And you as an agent could go down the drain with that. So that's sort of where I stand on it. But no, you don't have to. You have to give it to them if they ask, but if they don't ask, you can't give it to them. So, answer your question?
Good enough for now.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? God, quiet group today. Do I need to wake you up, or
I have lots more questions, but I feel like they should be held for another time.
I would agree. Okay, then. I think we're done. Hopefully you'll come back next week. Next week we'll dig into the meat and potatoes of it and walk you through a transaction and what your options are. So you've been in the biz a little bit, you've been doing transactions, but you want to know how to handle this and that, bring those questions and we'll chat through it. Okay, we're done. Thanks. Appreciate you attending.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.